Welcome to what's going to be a fabulous webinar tonight. I'm Robin Ewing, and with Michael Anderson, I co-direct the Create Centre, Creativity in Research, Engaging the Arts, Transforming Education, Health and Wellbeing. Before we start tonight, I'd like to pay my respects and acknowledge our First Nations Australians. As you will, no doubt, wherever you are in Australia, the University of Sydney is on Gadigal land, and perhaps you'd like to acknowledge where you're joining from in the chat. I want to also acknowledge that our First Nations Australians, and I think First Nations people everywhere, put creativity and the arts at the centre of their doing, knowing, being and becoming, and we have so much to learn from doing that. I also want to acknowledge that the land on which we're joining from was never ceded, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. If you haven't joined Create yet, I'd like to encourage you to do that. And I'd like now to pass to Michael, who's going to introduce our guest. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Robin. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this webinar this evening, which is in fact our 40th webinar, which makes us feel almost old. But something that isn't old is the study and exploration of creativity in schools. And we have none other than Professor Bill Lucas to speak to us tonight about that topic. And it's really exciting for me that Bill has had the time to do this, because of all the people that we know in Create internationally, Bill is one of the foremost exponents and kind of constructors of process and ideas and approaches to support schools in creativity. And I'm not only excited because we've got Bill tonight, but we've actually just started plans to run a Leading Creativity Symposium conference in February, and Bill will be with us there as well in person. So you might get the digital version of Bill this evening, but you'll be able to meet him in real life, go up and chat to him in real life, and that'll be fantastic as well. But who is Bill? Well, Bill is the director of the Centre for Real World Learning at the University of Winchester. He's an educational reformer, and as I said, one of the world's leading experts on creativity in schools. Bill is chair of the advisory board of the Global Institute of Creative Thinking and co-chair of the strategic advisory group of the PISA 2022 Creative Thinking Test and curator of the Creativity Exchange. So as you can see, Bill comes to us with a world of experience around creativity and creativity education. And I'm really looking forward to hearing some of what Bill has got to say tonight. So over to you, Bill, and thanks for joining us.
Michael, Robin, thank you so much for that ridiculously kind and generous welcome. And great to see one or two names and faces of people I recognise. Lovely to see you, Pam. And Pam, Michael, and I are all conspirators in the Global Institute of Creative Thinking. More of that as we go through this together, and just checking that although it's morning for me and evening for you, that I'm right, that our joint endeavour in 2024 is actually in March, not February, I hope. I know I've got Thomas on the call here, so he'll nod if I've got that
That's
right.
Correct. That's correct. I was so excited I got the dates wrong, Bill. So it is March, yeah.
It is March, yes.
Watch this space. So what I'd like to do in a few minutes when I start sharing my screen is really to just take a step back and think about the role of leaders. And I've got a very, very broad and inclusive definition of what we might mean by that. The role of leaders in schools, both in and working with schools, because lots of this happens with third-party organizations, and working at the system level too. The kind of things that we're beginning to know from the promising practices that many of you will know across the world, and indeed the research that underpins that. And I'm going to ask the question, what is creativity, unsurprisingly, and Pam will be pleased to know there are plural answers to that question. take you on a tour of some of the curious and interesting practices that we're seeing across the world, suggest that there are almost wherever you are, and there will of course be deeply important cultural differentiators, but suggest some principles that seem to obtain wherever you are working with schools. Take a riff into the world of assessment, and just see where that takes us. Some really important work that I'm involved in here in the UK with rethinking assessment, and with our colleagues in Melbourne, New Metrics for Success, just trying to rethink the rather wearisome, high stakes approach to assessment and measuring student progress. And then I'm going to pull out at the end with some key messages that I hope you might find helpful, and the kind of thing that you might choose to adapt in your context, or indeed not, if it doesn't resonate with you. So that's the plan. Let's see how we go. I'll chat for about 40 minutes, 45 minutes, and then if you're still up and interested, then I think Michael will kindly facilitate a conversation. So let me just share my screen. There's a bit of a logo clutter on that first slide, and I just want to, I've mentioned the Global Institute of Creative Thinking, and Michael's kindly mentioned the university, my base, and RA, short for Rethinking Assessment, and Leading for Creative Thinking is a website very much prototypical, under construction, that we're developing with the Welsh Arts Council and with an organisation called Creativity, Culture and Education in England, focusing on the leadership dimension of what we're talking about. And most recently, I've been active with a collective of colleagues. Some of you may know my colleague Louise Stoll from the Institute in London, and others from Welsh Arts Council and Creativity, Culture and Education, looking at the professional learning, which you do so well at Create, looking at the kind of implications and trying to make the whole business of professional learning playful, hence the title, A Leadership Playbook, and trying also to make a case, and this is case emerging from some recent research which we will be publishing in 2024, looking at the complex relationship between the creativity of the adults in the space and the creativity of the young people for whom they're responsible, and the organizational functions and structures that seem best able to bring this to life. So I'm not sure, it's relatively recent, whether if you chose to, you can get your hands on it in Australia. Who knows, maybe somebody will be kind enough to have a Google whilst we're online. And one of the things, here's just an example, and the QR code takes you to the website, is that still when we talk about creativity, and I know you'll be aware of this, and please don't get me wrong with the third of these myths. I'm not saying that the arts are not important. I'm arts trained myself, but I think we're beyond assuming that the arts are uniquely what it is to be synonymous with being creative. Our great engineers, our great mathematicians, our great decent people trying to change the world need creativity to think new thoughts and to realize that their first thoughts are not their only thoughts. So in a school context, these are 5 myths that we find everywhere. The fact that it's still seen as to be kind of too vague, well, I'm going to try and dispel that. This heritability argument, which has a close link to kind of, are you a genius? And well, I can't possibly be one of those, can I? The arts I've mentioned. In the UK especially, actually in England especially, that somehow creativity is the enemy of a knowledge-rich curriculum or scholarship, or focusing on the things that schools really should be doing. I think that's deeply unhelpful. And there's rather binary and irksome debate about whether or not creativity links to domain or is domains, or whether it's domain neutral. For goodness sake, the answer is it depends, doesn't it? I mean, there are obviously ways in which you express your creativity in science that may look and feel a little different from when you're on the sports field. Equally, there are some creative processes that are largely generic, which need to be practiced in different contexts. And that's the thing, and that's where we as educators come in. Now, on the timetable, here's a mythical imagined timetable. Creativity is, of course, invisible, and that's the challenge for all of us who care about creativity. I went, interestingly, into a school in England recently where creativity actually appears on the timetable, and I'm not convinced that's a good idea, because if you're arguing that it's ubiquitous, then it's going to enter into every subject of the school curriculum. It's, if you like, a cross-curricular theme, entity, idea, cluster of skills, and I'll come on to that. If you were to have sailed from, let's say, Southampton, near to me in Winchester, down to Sydney, near to some of you, although delighted to see we've got someone from South Africa on the call. So we're sailing to the Southern Hemisphere. The extent of our geographic sciences as these great expeditions began was that we were on a flat Earth, and you're likely to tip over the edge. And who knows, the cartographers might have imagined a dragon lurking there who would nip your ship on its bottom as it fell off the edge. Well, of course, that was the state of our geographic science at that stage. And I use this as an image for the learning sciences in the plural today. We're increasingly knowing that where once we thought, here's the flat Earth analogy, really what you needed was competence in some core disciplines, some core subjects, the English, maths and sciences and all the rest of the world. Now we know that, of course, it's a lot more complicated. We need a whole range of other things. In Australia, you tend to refer to these things as general capabilities. I tend to think about them as dispositions or attributes or clusters of wider skills. Doesn't really matter what language we use. And there are some other things, aren't there, about being an effective learner. We know we need all of these things together. And that's the kind of model, the two-dimensional flat Earth model that I'm afraid still prevails in too many schools. I'm sure not anyone on this call. And that's the kind of image I'm going to keep coming back to, that we need to think always about what this three-dimensional world might look like. Here's a rather partial and partisan view of how creativity has emerged. Michael said we've known a lot about this in schools. We've had an interest, and I think arguably we might go back to J.P. Guilford's work on this, and a seminal lecture almost 80 years ago. Yes, almost 80 years ago. And then a jump of about 50 years to a period where England was in the news, in my view, for the right reason, when the late and much loved Sir Ken Robinson was producing his deeply authoritative report and starting to offer a view of what creativity was in schools. We had a flourishing of that, a funded flourishing in England called the Creative Partnerships. They commissioned us to develop the model that I'll talk about in a second. 10 years later, from that flourishing of the Creative Partnerships, we have organizations like the World Economic Forum, the Centre for Curriculum Redesign, beginning to get their hands around this. We have the state of Victoria beginning to think that critical and creative thinking is robust enough to be able to measure it. We've got back in England a key commission, which I'll tell you about. We've got international work going on at the Centre for Educational Research and Innovation. I'll show you a little bit about that. Michael's mentioned the Creativity Exchange, and of course the CREATE initiative is in a sense a creativity exchange, and there are probably a dozen or so similar organizations across the world trying to translate and to apply research and to build relationships out with communities of practice. I'm going to talk a little bit about the creativity collaboratives. At last, we're waking up in England to the possibility of this, and next year the results of the PISA creative thinking test that took place in 2022 will be published, and in 2022 the organization that Michael and Pam and I are in different ways trying to support, the Global Institute of Creative Thinking, is starting to think some new thoughts about how we can embed these kind of things. So with that brief geographical and historical throat clearing out of the way, what are some of the key moments here as we've thought about what creativity is? We'll let me take you back to the turn of the century and Ken Robinson's definition, and it stressed originality and value. And to be absolutely frank with you, colleagues, it scared the pants off many educators. And back to the way I started this, of course, my belief is that we need to value the originality and creativity of adults just as much as we do the creativity of young people, because they are the culture creators. They count triple in that culture. The rules and protocols and systems that the adults put in place frame the opportunities to develop and cultivate creativity. Value also was a value-laden concept. What do we mean by value? Is it economic value? Is it social value? Is it the value that gets credited by an ATAR score, for example? Well, possibly not. Now, somewhere between then and the model below, which is James Kaufman and Ron Beghetto's of a 4C sense of progression, the late and for me, something of a mentor, Anna Kraft, came up with the hugely helpful idea of everyday or little c creativity. That's to say that all of us have this capacity. And for me and my colleague and friend Guy Claxton in our thinking about creativity, it's really simple. Creativity is about being able to have an idea when you need it and knowing that your first idea is not your only idea. It's almost that simple. So it has embedded in it not just ideation and idea generation and divergent thinking, but also the rigor of critical thinking and more convergent thinking and recognition of context. And from that little c gem and germ of an idea, this very helpful 4C notion is developed. Around about 2011, 2012, we were commissioned to look at the literature of the kind that I've just been sharing and see if we could construct from the evidence a model that would be useful and practically applicable in schools. And it's a componential, for those of you interested in these things, model. So it goes back to people like Teresa and Marbolet's work and a history of thinking about creativity, which recognize that it's not just one thing. Imagination and inquisitiveness, or being imaginative and demonstrating your curiosity, are stock in trade of creativity. But the three other of the 5 creative habits, being persistent, I think you'll see from that flat earth model earlier on, I'm bringing in some of the evidence from the learning sciences here. Some of the work of colleagues like Carol Dweck and Angela Duckworth and David Perkins at Harvard and Ron Richart, where we're thinking about almost axiomatically when you're working at something which is tricky or which may be a little off-center, literally eccentric, you're going to need to be able to tolerate uncertainty and frankly dare to have opinions that are different from the mainstream. Collaboration, we're thrilled at the Global Institute to have recently welcomed Vlad Glavenue as one of our colleagues, and his work on social and collaborative creativity and creativities is groundbreaking, I believe. And for me, most of what we're doing is social. It involves us working with and for others. And of course, quite a lot of the literature of creativity is heroic. And I think that's unhelpful. It's unhelpful in a school and educational context. And the word discipline was mischievously selected. Guy and I argued hard about this because it's almost counterintuitive. But anybody, for example, who's worked in sports or arts knows that the power of practice, and here I'm drawing on a literature from people like Anders Ericsson and others, a literature of deliberate practice, where we know that there's a skill level here. So what I'm arguing for is a world of scholarship and skills, of these things existing symbiotically together. So the understanding of what the crafting and improving and prototyping processes are is critically important. And it's fascinating to me to see that when you look at subjects, most subjects have their own verb for this. If we were in English, we might be talking about drafting. In science, it might be inquiry. In engineering, it might be prototyping. In drama, it might be improvising or dance, and so forth. So we've got this language, and it's a language of exploration and a language of skill development. Close to you, just down the road in Rudy Hill High School, is probably one of our longest standing collaborators, the very wonderful Chris Causey and her extraordinary team. And they've taken that skeleton of the model and they've fleshed it out so that it's a living creature, a backdrop to the pedagogies and cultural decisions and all those other things that you have to do in a busy high school in this instance. Just carrying on now on this kind of journey, but I hope as we go, shining a light on what creativity is and how it fits or how it might fit. 2015, you see two contrasting publications with almost identical visual and content models. One, the World Economic Forum, the other, the Centre for Curriculum Redesign. And you see here a kind of tripartite sense of what it is to think about curriculum. You've got the knowledge or foundational elements of what most curriculum planners would see to be important, but interestingly, in the right-hand model, a move away from single disciplines towards interdisciplinarity. This is a global trend, colleagues. And then on the left of both models, you've got 4 words beginning with the letter C. You'll see from the way I'm developing that I'm combining creativity and critical thinking. I'm going to be arguing, and this is where free thinking assessment is going, that in a rather neat acronym, where once we depended on allegedly 3 R's, of course, it's a hopeless acronym, but the reading, writing, and arithmetic, now we have 3 C's. And it's not an either or, we need both of these in the world that we inhabit. 2015 sees the birth of the Victorian Curriculum and Assessment Authority's work in this area. So not only have they scoped out curriculum progression and curriculum design, but I believe a world first, and very, very proud to have been working with them. And for example, developing for the Melbourne Age a supplement that was trying to explain what this is. This is not weird. This is not odd to the parents and employers of that fair city. Now we're moving on to 2019, and I think some really helpful work here in England at last. We're waking from a long slumber. We've been in the slowest of international curriculum lanes, in my humble opinion. But here a helpful Arts Council England-backed initiative. The Arts Council fascinatingly arguing that whilst the arts are important, of course, it's more than the arts. And here's the abstract definition of creativity. Here's a process definition in the middle. And here's this explicit shifting of this to a definition that focuses on, and this builds on some of the OECD work, systematic, intentional cultivation of creativity in young people. Here's the report, if you've not seen it, of a 4-year study that I was proud to be part of, where across 11 different countries, neither England nor Australia sadly was part of it, but it's a really rich mix. It's one of the only research endeavors I've been involved in that's had Russia and the United States as contributing countries. Sadly, that wouldn't happen at the moment. They're just some headlines, and you'll see it's driving us towards the support we need. So, first key message, it's hardly rocket science, this. If you're sitting here, whatever level of leadership you are in a school or school system, the importance on a different kind, the focus on a different kinds of professional learning is really, really important. And then we have, back in 2019, the launch of, and then the delivery of, in 2022, the creative thinking test. And if you've not come across the Thinking Outside the Box, published last year from PISA, really helpful. So PISA moving away from being a summative document, if you like, a glorified league table, as it is in literacy and numeracy and science to an extent, but more thinking about how can PISA elevate the field by defining rigorously what a concept is, and then beginning to flood the system with formative assessment processes that might be useful. With my colleagues in the Global Institute, we were pleased to launch in London and in Paris last year, with strong support from the OECD, a kind of snapshot of where we're getting to. And I have pinched the dashboard idea of my friend John Hattie here, you'll see, and I've added a simple color coding to it. The red, amber, green of a traffic light in some countries across the world. And you see that in terms of status, curriculum, and kind of beginnings of an understanding of pedagogies, we're making progress. And in terms of assessment, we're just getting out of the blocks. And in terms of professional learning, actually Sydney's an outlier here, as is the University of Cumbria in the UK, PAM Centre 2 in Cambridge. There are actually very few, especially almost zero in initial teacher training, doing anything at all that is about equipping the teachers of tomorrow to take this seriously, let alone the continuous professional learning and development that we need taking place. So I'm switching now gear to just some examples internationally. And I've already touched on the World Economic Forum, and I've already touched on the curriculum, the Centre for Curriculum Redesign. But let's just take you on a little bit of tour and stand back using the work of the Brookings Institution. If you're not familiar with this, it's terrific what they've been doing. Some of their work most recently being funded very helpfully by the Lego Foundation, also a key player in these discussions, and taking their 4C model, and I've crunched together creativity and critical thinking. You'll see how they've looked at jurisdictions across the world and seen that in terms of, and this very much reinforces the message of the previous slide, in terms of inclusion and identification, increasingly progression, it's beginning to take place. But in terms of coherent guidance about pedagogy and assessment, it's still pretty minimal. I'll be very interested. This is an open question to you, colleagues, if we have time to have this debate. To what extent is your state or your country or whatever form you're in, if you're in the UK, your academy trust, if you're in the States, your district, or if you're just in a loose alliance or a group of schools like the Big Picture schools, for example, doing great work in this regard in Australia, what it is for you, how you're making systematic progress in pedagogy and assessment. Now, if you're an Australian on this call, then this is obvious to you. It's obvious because you'll recognize what I pulled out of one of the Gonski reports on the left, and you'll recognize the ACARA model with its 4 core ideas. You'll see, I hope, quite a strong overlap, the kind of thinking I've been sharing. And of course, it begs a question, doesn't it? For a curriculum specifying organization, you can say what it is, but that's simply the beginning. And where I'm going to be taking you throughout this is, of course, how do you implement this on a Monday morning? How do you implement this at the beginning of each of 4 terms, if you're in Australia, 3 terms, if you're in the UK, in terms of your thinking about the professional learning necessary to embed inquiring, identifying, and exploring ideas in every subject of the curriculum? And what does that look like? And you'll see, too, the Webb and Weft model, which I like very much, of the Australian curriculum, at least in theory. Forgive me for saying it like this, that in the vertical axis, you've got subject disciplines. In the horizontal axis, you've got critical and creative thinking and these other all-important cross-curricular ideas. Interestingly, I think that creativity is alive and happiest in national bodies where there's a competence-based curriculum. So you see this in Canada, you see this in about 10 other countries across the world. And if you wanted to find out more, that report I flashed up from the Global Institute of Creative Thinking, the snapshot report, will give you all of this. And maybe I'm just talking to my Create colleagues here, if it's possible to, if that's not already uploaded as part of this webinar material, that would be great. It's been my privilege recently to work with colleagues in Shanghai and Beijing, and I know several others on this call are similarly engaged, who've taken our model and adapted it in a problem-based learning way and trying to make it relevant to the local industries and local interests of, in this case, Jiading, one of the districts that we've been working with. And you can see, and this is a key message, and I'm sure that all of us who develop frameworks love this, the greatest favor anybody can do to us is when something that you start is adapted and made personal and made local, as indeed has been the case here. Alberta in Canada is a great example of a state that's acting as translator, saying we recognize that we need to translate what it is to be, in their language, creative and innovative and a critical thinker in mathematics. And to do this at the high level, but not to take away the creative opportunities of teachers to be able to make that their own in their classroom. In the state of Victoria, just down the road from you, some really neat, further detailed specification of what progression looks like, taking the ACARA model and adapting it, and I think simplifying it. We've moved from 4 to 3 core areas, and I like the metacognitive strand. It seems to be very, very important in what we're talking about. Here's some work I've been doing in Western Australia with colleagues in a arts-based cultural organization Form. Some of you may know, I'll come back to them later, showing how very, very young children can be very articulate in reflecting on their progress, and then using, we've made it into a football here so that it's a bit more fun, And of course, that's the playfulness is all part of it. Here in London, here's a close cousin to what Rudy Hill's been doing, similar kind of length of time. So these are schools that have been at this for 8, 9, 10 years, really working out the web and weft and the nuance and what it is. And here's up close, you can see some of the core language that's being used right across the piece, and some of the kind of pedagogy toolkit that's part of this offer. And here, right down in the south of Chile, a wonderful little school on the side of a lake that's taken our model and translated it into their almost forest school-like activity. Across the world, I'm honoured to say that this model is now being used in 30 or more countries. So, sorry, Michael, I realise I've just lopped off Melbourne and Sydney in my map there. That's my cartographical hopelessness rather than anything malign. Here's the Creativity Exchange website. If you're not familiar with it, it's an explicit attempt at curating useful materials, evidence-based, from promising practices, absolutely based in schools. Just Google Creativity Exchange. And here are the creativity collaboratives, funded clusters of schools in 8 different areas of England, and coming together as a professional learning community, many of them using, not all of them, using our model. And when we can get some of you guys over here, you guys and girls, it'd be great to take you to some of these places, because at last we've got some things I feel proud to share. Now, so how do you do all this stuff? Well, forgive me, I'm probably by definition preaching to those of you who are doing this already. And let me just offer some things that we're drawing from our research. I'm going to recognize that a huge amount of what happens in schools is informal, but I'm just going to focus on the formal element of this because there are only 45 minutes and I've only got another 12 to say what I want to say. So standing back and just assuming, therefore, that formal is largely about curriculum, just really important to be thankful that we have an OECD in general and an individual in Andreas Schleicher who is tirelessly campaigning for this. There's that report I mentioned. If you Google it, you can get your own copy. It's on the Global Institute site. It's on ResearchGate. It's on quite a lot of sites now if you want to get it. Here's some Norwegian researchers who've taken this and done something incredibly simple that I love. So imagine you're in a staff room just asking yourself the question, so to what extent are we giving young people opportunities to develop this multi-componential aspect of this wonderful thing called what it is to be human and creative? And interestingly, in this mythical staff room, there isn't enough focus on questioning, and there isn't any focus on using your intuition, and so on. So here's just a simple visualization of what it is to make opportunities explicit and systematic. And this brings me to the first of 4 principles. This is all about culture. It's all about language. Honestly, if I could just have one thing that I would be talking about, it is the culture, is what this school does when it thinks nobody's looking, is what this classroom teacher does when she doesn't think that anybody's going to pop in and see what's going on, when this classroom assistant does in a very quiet way, in a 1-to-1, 1-to-2 kind of intervention, not what they think they should be doing, but what they believe is really important to creating a culture where creativity can flourish. And here I'm drawing on so many different researchers' work, especially my colleague Anna Craft and all of her work on possibility thinking. And here in the UK, colleagues like Teresa Kremen. There's a whole host of people, too many to mention, who together, Ron Bagetto's work would be very important here too, have begun to map out the elements of what it is to create a culture which invites creativity. And of course, in a busy high school, leaving space for the unexpected is really tricky. As kids get older, as you get closer to public examinations, playful experimentation gets more tricky. And one of the opening activities I would typically do in a school is to say, taking those 10, which are you doing best? And what does it look like when you're doing it well? And which are you doing least well? And how might you do it even better? And what would it look like if you were doing it even better? And suddenly you've got an agenda. Here in the UK, we have this crazy debate going on, fueled by a very unhelpful current Department for Education. I'm very happy to be quoted on that pits knowledge against these other things like being creative. It's silly. We need what my colleague Guy Claxon and I have referred to for a long while as a split screen universe in which we equally value things which might historically have been called knowledge or discipline or subject discipline, and the other things that didn't appear on my flat earth image. All these other things that we know are important around character and the development of human beings, and the 3 C's of which creative thinking, I'm arguing, is a very big part. Now, the minute you accept that premise, you've got to do curriculum design in a different way. As a school leader, you've got to do curriculum planning in a different way. And you're probably going to recognize that as you cross-map this, you've got to think about the school timetable in a different way. You've got to think about longer lessons in some cases where you can actually not be stymied by the bell going 53 minutes into the moment where you're just getting going. Back to the state of Alberta, you remember I showed you something about maths. Here, they've done the same thing for each of these core disciplines, showing how you can lock science and creativity and innovation together. Now, if I was working with schools, which I often am, I'd be saying, so it's very helpful to have a top-level idea here, to know where you're going with the grain, and then have your scientists think about what it is they want to focus on, then think about how they're going to plan opportunities for creativity and science to be mutual bedfellows throughout the curriculum. One of my favorite artists is Andy Goldsworthy, and here is a lovely sculpture of his showing, I mean, I can imagine that the task was to design and build a dry stone wall in an area of wetland. And what his image shows me is how you can interweave, interleave. So the dry stone wall is the beautiful creativity for me, and the forest around it are the vertical axis, back to that web and weft image I was using, of the subject disciplines, and they work in harmony together. It's not an either or, it's a collaborative endeavor. Ron Richart and colleagues at Project Zero at Harvard have for long tried to unpick the big idea and reduce it to core thinking routines. I think this is a really powerful and helpful idea, principle 3, that we need to make that which is abstract, concrete, and visible. So to go back to our model, if you just wanted to think about some of these very simple routines that you can get established. This, for example, colleagues, I am an English teacher by background, an English and drama teacher before going into policy and academia. I would have said that these routines are the grammar of what it is to be creative. And I think we need to be explicit about them. So if you, for example, just took Think, Puzzle, Explore, you can see how that's going to be a building block of developing a toolkit of imaginative learning resources. And See, Think, Wonder is at the absolute, it's a kind of noun, isn't it? As you begin to assemble the sentence that is going to be what it is to be a curious and inquisitive learner. Here's some work I've been doing in Western Australia, showing how very, very little children can not only playfully use that football version of our model, but each one has, no expense spared, a jam jar. And in that jam jar, lumps of plasticine, or there could be marbles, color-coded, so that they're beginning to have a language of creativity. Here, this is Ellenbrook Christian College in and around Perth, working with cultural partners from that great organization Form that I've already name-checked. And the fourth of these 4 principles is so obvious as to be embarrassing, but we haven't yet, I think, although we're getting up to speed now, really thought systematically about which pedagogies work very well in the advancement of key disciplinary concepts, science or maths or history or geography or whatever it is, but also work very well when it comes to cultivating creative young people. And we've done the kind of mapping job in the work that Ellen Spencer, my colleague at the Centre for Real World Learning, and I've been doing and published that here. But it's just the tip of the iceberg. Sorry, I've not got a chance to go into this. This very definitely is available if you're interested in Australia, if you were wanting to develop that. And many of the case studies are Australian schools. So you might find that interesting. Rudy Hill High School is one of them. but there are many others too. If you're in the staff room, I guess this might be closer to the language that you might be chatting about if you were sipping a cup of coffee, a well-earned cup of coffee or tea in your break time. Now, the final bit of what I want to say before I just pull out and tease out some messages is, what about assessment? Well, I think there's a language issue here. Many of us passionate about creativity probably bridle a little bit when we use the word assess or measure, because it could seem to cut in a rather simplistic view of what it is to be creative. And I'm increasingly using the language of evidencing and the language of evidencing progression. And I think there are some really good ways that we can use, and I'll show you what we've been doing both in Australia and in England here. And I think it's helpful to think about what you can do digitally, and State of Victoria doing some fantastic stuff here. And there are lots of apps out there to help you, working from right to left, just to be unconventional, how you can be more authentic, involving adults who aren't teachers, and then obviously the things that teachers can do using progression rubrics, and what you can get kids to do too. There's a field guide that I've co-developed with colleagues in Perth at Form. Again, this is free to wear. If you're interested, it'd be great if we could just have this in the same place whenever you are able to put the recording of this up online. Now, I've recently been collaborating with the Australian Council for Educational Research's UK branch, and we've just completed a small-scale intervention in 20 schools, taking a version of our model and looking at 5 core subjects: English and science and history and art and design and technology, mapping progression, and using a model of professional learning to see if we can skill up teachers to use different assessment methods. And we'll be writing up the fruits of this and publishing that in November this year. The good news is that you can do it even in the hostile environment of England. So just think what you could do in more generous, spirited curricula, such as your own in Australia and in the individual states' interpretation. Here's just one example of how we've developed a rubric and how we're beginning to look at how you track progression. The end game here, and it's part of your emerging policy landscape in Australia, is that rather than leaving with A levels solely or ATAR scores solely, we want all-round strength-based assessment. And you'll see in the top left-hand corner of Rethinking Assessments prototype profile, 3 Cs of creative thinking, collaboration, and communication. You can imagine how you would click through and see evidence that would show the progression of the learners that you're trying to, whose all-round strengths you're trying to celebrate. Now, I want to pull out now, and just in the last couple of slides, just try and round up some of the messages that I think we're learning. This comes from some research undertaken a couple of years ago, funded by the Mercers, and looking at a small-scale qualitative study of school leaders in English secondary schools, looking at the kind of things that work and don't work for them, and teasing out from that a kind of agenda, if you like, a task list from all those. And remember, my conception of leadership is frankly anybody in a school. So certainly a class teacher is exercising her or his leadership role, but I'm thinking about middle leaders especially, and I'm thinking about school and system leaders. So there is an agenda. I hope you'll find that the agenda is consonant with everything I've been saying. The professional learning community is something I know that Michael and colleagues and Robin at Curator have been leading on, and some wonderful examples of schools that have been at this for a while in New South Wales and beyond. Most recently, I've been working with the creativity collaboratives in England. I nearly said the UK, but it's actually in England. And I've been visiting all of them and looking at what seem to be some early indicators of progress. And I've tried to track this and chart this in a move from a world in which let's give it a go, let's do it as a project, starts to lead to a world in which it becomes normal, a world in which it is invisible, in which we've moved to a cultural landscape, a bit like the Rudy Hill or Tallis model, where it's explicit. Strong research evidence from the OECD work to show that how that is the case. And I'm not going to insult your intelligence by reading through this. If you're the kind of person who likes to capture something and can't wait for the recording, then maybe take out your phone and take a picture of this. And if you are using this, by all means do. This is super hot off the press, so be grateful if you acknowledge it. Wasn't space on the slide for me to do that. And I hope you find it really interesting, and it'll be fantastic when I'm over to see whether it resonates with you and colleagues in Australia. Here are just some examples of largely free resources. If anything I've been saying has struck a useful tone. So the Creative School Leadership and the Creative Thinking Schools, both available from Form's website. The Creative Leadership is widely available. It's on the Creativity Exchange site. I'm afraid you have to shell out a few dollars for the book. And then Rethinking Assessment is also freely available on the web. And thanks so much, Michael. Michael has been one of a number of generous colleagues who've said some entirely unbelievable things about what we're trying to do in the playbook. And we hope that you might find this helpful, and indeed that you might choose to go to the website where you'll see leadingforcreativithinking.org. We're going to flood the system with free resources, as well as obviously having to pay for the place by occasionally asking you to put your hand in your pocket and dip in there. The Global Institute for Creative Thinking website is the last one there. And Rethink Assessment. I mentioned new metrics for success. We're on the cusp of some really interesting partnership work. And when I'm out in Australia, in Melbourne, the week before I'm in Sydney, I'm really looking forward to some great conversations with colleagues there. So thanks so much. Thanks for still being with us, and look forward to a conversation if you've still got the energy now.
Thanks, Bill. Such a whirlwind trip around what's going on internationally in creativity. It's so useful, I think, to know that for those of us who care about creativity in schools, that we're not alone, that there's a kind of a groundswell going on, and there's lots of things happening. So if people want to ask questions, please feel free just to pop them in the chat, and then I might ask you to unmute and then ask your question, or I can ask it, whatever works. I've got one really which touches on PISA and the creative thinking test. So obviously that we've now had the first iteration of that test, and the results I think are still to come to various jurisdictions. What do you think the impact of that will be, if any? And understanding and acknowledging that PISA is divisive, there's a lot of people who think it's nonsense and a lot of people who think it's fantastic. Where do you see the benefits coming from that test, if you do see benefits?
I do see the benefits likely to accrue. Being completely frank, when I was invited initially to chair and then to my relief co-chair the advisory board, I had my doubts. And I had my doubts because when we were running field trials for our own model, I vividly remember a session I facilitated at the Design Council when somebody very angrily got up, almost left the room, and said, "I used to like your work, Bill. How dare you reduce creativity to what might be a reductionist letter 3B or level 3B?" So I've always had this in the back of my mind. Am I poacher turned gamekeeper or the other way round? And so I've had a nervousness about it. But I think, and here I'm now going to flip sides and make the case for why I think it's really important. Number one, I think that, like it or lump it, PISA is hugely influential. So if we care about something, it would be ridiculous if you were a scientist or a teacher of literacy or a teacher of numeracy, to say our subject is not important enough for the global testing or body to come up with some kind of coherent test. So I think there's a standing argument. Secondly, I think there's a rigor argument. you can only assess something if you're able to describe it in enough depth and detail. And I think, and it's one of the myths, I think for many of our colleagues out there, there's a laziness that says this creativity thing is too vague for me to get my hands around, therefore I'm not going to do it. The third thing, and this is, I think, a subtle thing, is that by showing that you can assess it, although it will be used by some as a league table, by the way, it will also be a wake-up call for my own Minister for Schools. I say mine, I share him with Pam and others from England, realizing that they will not like being ranked at a lowly level if that's what happens. And if they're ranked at a higher level, they will like that. And that will make them say, oh, maybe this creativity thing is okay after all. So either way, we win there. But the real prize is that we're understanding formative assessment. Now, by analogy, if you go back to 2015, when the collaborative problem-solving test was introduced, based on the work of Patrick Griffin and colleagues at Melbourne Uni, many of us had our doubts, but actually it's enabled a much more rigorous approach to the honouring and assessment of collaborative endeavour in schools. So I think it's a good, but I think it's a fine call. Michael, there are a couple of publications, and I'll make sure I send to you and to Anna the most recent one, which looks at the ways in which this may be systematically helpful with policymakers too. So you wouldn't expect me not to, having got into bed with it, but I think it can do some good. But I hugely understand your and some other colleagues' reservations.
And I suppose one of the things that I'm mindful of is that there's a kind of a tension. You know, the rethinking assessment work is talking about how we reduce emphasis on standardized testing, and then there's the PISA work on the other. So I suppose in my mind that's a tension, but maybe there's not. You don't see that as a tension, or maybe it is.
I think it is just a tension, but I think that's life. That's life. Michael, I can see in the chat a question that I'd love to jump in on. Would that be okay?
Let's go on to that question. Yeah.
Sorry.
I don't know who that is, but if they want to unmute and ask that, that'd be great. Or I can ask.
The name of the contributor is Creative Director, which is rather lovely.
Yeah.
Hi.
Do you want to articulate the question?
Yeah, sure. So I should have updated my screen. My name's Alex. So my question really is, I sit on a senior leadership team in an international educational context, which has a revolving door of leadership, as anyone who knows the sector will understand. So my question is, how do you approach other members within a leadership team who create a false binary between the idea of knowledge and creativity, fundamentally because they successfully propel themselves through their own education via success in academia through academic rigor?
Great question, and it's the question which swims its way through our playbook. It is so often articulated, or actually sometimes not articulated, and great that you are choosing, Alex, to articulate it. Well, I think at a number of different levels. What we've discovered works well is to require senior leadership teams. Well, you can't require unless you have the support from the principal or head teacher, but to encourage them to revisit the question, what's the purpose of school? This is a big, systematic, epistemic, philosophical question. If you think the purpose of school is to churn out people who have high ATAR scores or do well on the International Baccalaureate or whatever alone, then you have a very thin definition of what it is to be human. And actually, when you push senior leaders in private, that's important about that, very few people will say that. So once you've got that chink open, the next level of this conversation is, well, so let's look at what this creativity thing is. And were you to take our model, or in fact, if you were to take pretty much any credible model, you'd see that there's a huge overlap between creative learning processes and metacognition and good learning processes. And actually, you can start to extract some of those, curiosity and questioning, feedback and reflection, the ability to work with others, which if you just took John Hattie's meta-analytical studies, have very high impact studies in a more impact factors in a more conventional attainment landscape. So you start pulling these out. Then I think you start to say, well, actually, this is really interesting discussion, isn't it? So let's disaggregate creativity still further. If you look at the critical thinking end of it, there's some really good research that's beginning to show, some done by the Education Endowment Foundation in the UK, some that we were commissioned to do for the Victorian Curriculum Assessment Authority, some that Ron Paghetto and colleagues have done, which shows the correlation between schools that do creativity really well and schools that, the results in the tests. What's not to want? Suddenly you've no longer got a binary, you've got a win-win. So you're starting to tease these things out. And then you're starting to have a much more fundamentally interesting conversation about, so let's get the scientists together and let's think about these creative habits of mind, and let's invite them to think about, so what are the scientific habits of mind that you're really valuing? And once you move away from knowledge or skills, or knowledge or dispositions, you realize that this round earth view of what it is to be human and what it is to be a successful, flourishing individual is that we need to know some stuff, we need to be able to do some stuff, and we need to be able to be disposed to do stuff. These are the dispositions and capabilities and habits of mind which we've acquired through practice in different contexts. So suddenly you've got yourself into a more interdisciplinary landscape. And then I think you're going to start saying, this conversation we were having in last week's management meeting about the role of AI. Well, actually, this creativity thing is very, very markedly what it is to be human. And there are going to be some things that AI will not do for a very, very long time because it scoops off the best that's been thought and said, rather than how we exercise our originality or our novel thinking. And suddenly you've engineered a bigger discussion. And forgive me if I put it quite so bluntly, Alex, but if none of this works or floats your boat, buy a copy of our latest playbook, because a lot of the professional learning activities are all about exploring this. So listen, I don't know if I've even nibbled away at a little bit of your question.
No, that was fantastic. Interestingly, I was speaking with Nia Richards the other day, trying to track down where we could get the playbook in this neck of the woods. But any link for ordering would be much appreciated on the chat. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And I know that's something our wonderful independent publishers, Crown, are on it. It used to be Hawker Brownlow, but I know it's somebody different. So I'll try and answer that question for you, Alex.
Fabulous. Well, we're coming to time. I just wanted to, I think, join with everyone.
Could we possibly have a look at Meg's question that was just above that one?
I missed that one. Meg, yeah, go ahead.
Answer.
Yeah, look, thank you very much, everyone, particularly Bill. Lucas, I'm coming new to this territory. I'm in theatre and performance studies at UNSW, and I'm very interested in creativity within the context of tertiary education, and just wondering what you might suggest there as a starting point for reading, particularly with regard to some of the key thinkers.
So I think we've been slow off the blocks in schools, and forgive me, those of us on this call who work in higher education, I think arguably we've been even slower off the blocks. I will, by the way, ask Pam to see if she can recommend anything in a second. I would recommend you go to the OECD Ceres website and look at their current research project on creativity in higher education. And if you go there, Meg, you'll land on a number of universities that are doing fantastic work across the world in this space. In a partisan way, I would recommend my colleague Paul Sowden here at the University of Winchester, who's Professor of Psychology and is doing some really interesting work and is leading our work as an institution as part of that project. But I think I would defer to other colleagues on this call. I don't feel well enough able to answer that. Pam, I don't know if there's anybody who comes to mind in your head here.
Thank you very much, Bill.
Hi, Meg. I've just put into the chat a couple of possibilities, but I'll I mean, if you go to the SIG for higher education at BERA, a British Education Research Association website, you'll see loads of names of people who are researching HE. Now, there's also Anushka Bailey, who uses a post-humanist new materialist view on HE specifically. Again, does she actually kind of speak directly to creativity? Well, you know, yes and no. But if you think of authoring change as a creativity, then yes, she does. And in her reference lists, there'll be, you know, an entire tribe of other people that are researching HE. She did her PhD in HE on HE. But there's also the Journal of Higher Education, which I know you would know, where people are researching, whether it doesn't matter that they're not mentioning creativity, I think, because we have to translate, we have to join the dots and use our own specialist kind of, you know, exercise to make that connection and bring them in. And I think that prevents us also from being an island, a silo in and of itself, to make those connections with other people's research in HE.
Wonderful. Thank you too, Pam. Much appreciated.
Thanks, Meg. I've also dumped a couple of things in the chat that might be of interest, a couple of articles into Times Higher Ed that talked about creativity in higher ed. So there's plenty to look at.
Thank you. Thank you all.
So I think that draws our time to a close. Thanks so much, Bill, for such a wonderful tour and such a thoughtful engagement with this huge topic. And I'm really looking forward to March next year, when we can really go into some depth in the Leading Creativity in Schools conference, which will probably be held around the Hickson Wharf precinct for those of you in Sydney. So just stay tuned to the Create information and the newsletter. Become a member of Create if you're not already, and you'll get more information about that. The link's in the chat. But thanks again to Bill. Thanks to Anna for facilitating everything, and look forward to seeing you all at the next Create event. Bye.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks, Bill.